subject in this class. And for most of you, probably nothing in this class is exciting. But this is probably about the worst of the worst. So it's just going to try to get through this. There's like some accounting kind of stuff where we're looking at the firm's costs that they're facing. And we're going to use those to create graphs. The main thing we're interested in is marginal cost and average total cost, because we'll be using those over the next couple chapters. And over the next couple chapters, unlike this one, there will be more, I don't know, actual real-world relevance. Whereas this, we're just literally just working up to draw some curves. So we're going to walk through an example for Jill Johnson's pizza restaurant, like the rest of this chapter. Basically, we're going to like really simplify it so that the only two inputs she has are pizza ovens and workers. We're not going to worry about the ingredients, about, I don't know, the tables in the restaurant, anything else like that. We're literally just looking at workers and pizza ovens. The pizza ovens are going to be fixed. So over this time frame, or in the short run, Jill cannot change the number of ovens she has. If she has 2 ovens, that's all she can work with in this period. On the other hand, she can add workers or increase her hours as much as she wants. So that's going to be a variable input. Again, we're simplifying a lot here, but the purpose of simplifying like this is so we can understand the relationship between variable cost and fixed cost. We have a lovely slide with a whole lot of numbers on it. This is basically the cost that she's facing. So, remember we said technology was just the process by which firms turn inputs into outputs. We're not just talking about like new computers or something like that. It can include management techniques, anything involved in the process, turning inputs into outputs. So basically with the process by which Jill's employees turn pizzas, or turn those ingredients into pizzas, the more workers she hires, the more pizzas she can produce. So you see that here. Number of workers, if she has 0 workers, there's no one doing the work. We end up with 0 pizzas per week. Remember, the pizza ovens are fixed, so there's going to be 2 no matter what. Now, if she adds 1 worker, they can now produce 200 pizzas per week. And we're now increasing the amount by 200. If she adds a second worker, she can now make a total of 450 pizzas per week. We're increasing the number of pizzas each time. So this is called the firm's production function. Basic idea, comparing, in this case, the labor, the variable cost, and the capital, in this case, fixed cost. So right here we have pizza oven, fixed cost at $800, so $400 per pizza oven. That's staying the same no matter what, no matter how much she produces, again, because it's fixed. But the cost of the workers, or variable cost here, is going to increase. Let's say she pays $650 per worker, every worker makes that. The more workers she hires, the more pizzas she can make, but the more the labor cost increase. So it starts out with 1 worker at $650. She ends up hiring 6 workers. She's paying $3,900 per week. So her costs are going up steadily as she's adding more and more workers. Now, the total cost of her pizzas per week is going to be the sum of the fixed cost and variable cost. And by definition, we break down total cost into those 2 types of cost. So with 0 workers, she's making 0 pizzas, but she still has that fixed cost of $800. She's still paying for those pizza ovens, even though she's not making any pizzas. So in this case, the total cost is going to be $800. Even if she produces nothing, she still faces that fixed cost. Then her total cost of pizzas increases by how much the variable cost is. So if she has 1 worker, you have the fixed cost of $800 and the variable cost of $650 for that employee. So her total costs are $1,450. And those are going to increase as the number of workers she hires increases. Yeah, so basically same information here, and just includes stuff about the fixed and variable costs. I don't want to talk about that yet. All right. So we can graph the costs for Jill's Restaurants just using that information from the previous graph. So remember our fixed cost here, our total cost of pizza per week because of the fixed cost is $800. So even if she produces 0 pizzas per week, she still has this cost up here of $800. So the cost curve isn't going to start at 0. It's going to start at whatever that fixed cost is. So the total cost of producing pizzas, we go back to the slide, is going to go up over time, and she's hiring more workers. So we see it in the second to last column increasing. So we're going to see the total cost increase as we're making more and more pizzas. There's something I want you to notice. That curve starts out pretty flat. So we're making a lot more pizzas initially for a small increase in cost. And then eventually the cost gets higher and higher, and the number of pizzas she's producing are smaller and smaller. So going from 0 workers to 1 worker gets you, what, 240 pizzas? For not a big increase in cost. But then when we go from the last one, what, 5 workers to 6 workers, it's a pretty large increase in cost and very few pizzas she's getting back for it. This is an important concept that we're going to need to remember going forward. Okay, but we're not going to talk about it yet, apparently. So now let's look at the average total cost of pizzas, the average total cost of production. So the total cost divided by the number of units she's producing. So first, the average total cost of pizza is pretty high, $7.25 when we have 1 worker. But then as we start to add more workers, we add a second worker, average total cost drops to $4.67. What we see here is when we go from, in this case, from 0 workers to 1 worker, we add 200 pizzas. When we go from 1 to 2, we add 250 pizzas. We go from 200 to 450. Then when we go from 2 workers to 3 workers, we add an additional 100. From 3 to 4, an additional 50. Then an additional 25, then 15. So as we're adding more and more workers over time, we're getting fewer and fewer pizzas back. And that's going to shape the average total cost. So initially, the average total cost falls. That second worker ends up adding more pizzas than the first. So the average total cost falls from the first worker to the second worker. Then as we start adding more workers, we're not getting as much pizza back from it. They're not producing as much as its second one, but we're adding the same cost. So we end up with the average total cost increasing again. And this is a trend we're going to see in general for firms. Initially, the average total cost falls, and then it begins to rise. So here we have that graph visually. I think these graphs make a lot more sense. They're a lot more intuitive to work with than looking at a big chart of numbers like this. But I want to talk about like where these come from, rather than just skipping this chapter and going into perfect competition, actually seeing why we have the curve shaped this way. So it'll help you guys remember at least a little bit more. We have our average total cost of what, $7.25 with 1 employee. We see it drop down and then slowly increase again over time. So we get that U shape for the average total cost. Initially, for the average total cost, fixed cost is a large portion of that. So here for our first worker, the fixed cost is $800, the variable cost is $650. So the reason why, and one of the reasons why it's so high initially, and it falls over time at first, is because you have that fixed cost that's spread out over more and more units as you add more workers and they're able to produce more. So we have that U-shaped average total cost. So let's think through why this is the case. So if Jill Johnson is one worker, remember she's not working there, she's hiring people to just do all the work for her. If there's one worker at a pizza shop, they're gonna take orders, they're gonna make the pizzas, they're gonna be in there making, cooking them to make sure that they're not burning and everything. They're running the pizzas out to the tables, they're running the cash register, they're doing everything here. They're cleaning up, they're doing dishes. This is a lot of stuff they have to do. So even though, obviously, with 0 workers, you're not making anything. So you see a big jump by hiring that one worker. They're still gonna have trouble doing everything and doing it easily. Anyone here been understaffed at work before? And you end up running around and it's miserable. You're not as productive as normal. You guys can't do as much as you normally can because you're missing someone from your team. This is an extreme example of that, just to highlight how this works. So if Jill hires a second worker, they can then split up what they're doing. One can focus on taking orders and bringing pizzas to the table, maybe running the cash register too. The other one focuses on just making the pizzas, just the food in the kitchen, and then cleaning up the dishes and stuff. You have one in the front, one on the back end. That does 2 things. First of all, they're not running around, so it's easy for them just physically to do the work because they're staying in that location. But a second and more important reason is that we end up with specialization. When people focus on just one task or a small subset of tasks, they get better at it. It might sound kind of common sense or kind of silly to say, but this is really important when we're trying to figure out how firms should go about producing goods. Adam Smith wrote about this in The Wealth of Nations. This is one of the many contributions from that book, was about the power of the division of labor. When we split up these tasks, so one person focuses on a small subset of tasks rather than everyone trying to do everything, workers get more skilled at that one task. As you get better and better at that task, you become more productive. So the example he gave was like a pin factory when they're making just little tiny pins. And there were 19 different jobs. Someone came up with the idea, instead of everyone making pins from scratch, which would take an hour, everyone did one little task. One person drew out the wire, one person made a point on the end, one person fattened the other side, one person smoothed it down so it wasn't sharp. One made sure it was perfectly straight. And by doing this, they can it took 10 minutes to make one pin. So they became much more productive. And we see this in every industry out there, that as people focus on doing specific tasks, they get better at those tasks. And the firms become much more productive. So that's why when we went from 1 worker to 2 workers, we increased the amount of production from 200 pizzas to 450 pizzas. That second worker makes them even more productive because we now have some specialization. We have some division of labor taking place. Now in our example, the restaurant, the gains from specialization end pretty quickly. But in large companies, we see this happening for a long time. So you keep adding more and more employees. They keep getting more and more productive as they specialize into more narrow tasks. So again, keeping the quantity of pizza ovens the same, keeping it 2 pizza ovens. As she adds more workers, she's able to make more and more pizzas. When we go from 1 worker to 2 workers, we go from 200 to 450. So the marginal product of labor, remember marginal means the next unit. So as you add 1 more unit of labor, in this case 1 more worker, what is the additional output you're getting? Moving from 0 to 200, the additional output, or the marginal product of labor, is 200. Moving from 200 to 450, that difference is 250. So the marginal product of labor there is 250. So you go from 2 to 3, we go from 450 pieces to 550 pieces. The difference there is only 100. So the marginal product of labor is 100. Then it goes down to 50, 25 to 15. So as we add more and more workers, after a certain point, we end up with a smaller marginal product of labor. Can anyone guess why this is the case? There's only two pizza ovens. What happens when you have too many people working and not enough jobs to do?
People start standing around.
They start standing around. People like get in each other's way. People stand around because, oh, someone else will do it. They start messing around. Guys ever worked at a place where you like had games to like pass time? I worked in the warehouse at a furniture factory, so we had a ton of those games to pass time. So I've like lived like marginal product of labor going down as you add more people. But yeah, and that's the reason why we're seeing this in this case is because we have that fixed capital, the fixed number of pizza ovens. Because that's not changing as you add more and more workers, there's only two pizza ovens you can work with. So there's only so many pizzas you can put in there. So productivity is going to fall over time. So we call this the law of diminishing returns. That at a certain point, as you add more of a variable input, so in this case labor, to the same amount of fixed input, the marginal product of the variable input is going to decline. So in this case, the marginal product of labor is going to fall because the number of pizza ovens is staying the same. And this is going to happen for all businesses. The point at which it'll happen will be different. Obviously, St. Francis doesn't face a falling marginal product of labor after 2 employees. St. Francis is a much higher number of employees. I don't even know how many people work here. But for a small place like a pizza shop, it may only be something small like 3 or 4 employees. In this case, it's after 2 because we're just working with a small number of employees to like have a good example. Again, the point of this isn't to be realistic as possible, but it's to show what's happening in the real world. Okay, so here we have graphs to illustrate the diminishing marginal product of labor. So here we have the output, the total output. So as we're adding more workers from 1 to 2, we have this increase. From 0 to 1. From 1 to 2, we have an even sharper increase. And then it starts to go flat. So as we're adding more and more workers, the output we're seeing increase is slowly going down. At this point, it's what, 250? Up here, it's like 15. So as we're going from the 5th to the 6th worker, we're not getting a lot of additional output because of that. Here's our marginal product. So we see that initially increase from 1 to 2, and then we see it going down to 6, all the way very low to that, adding that 6th worker. For those of you that had to take calculus, this is the marginal product right here. The derivative of this shows the rate of change. So you can see as this curve gets steeper here, you have an increase here. And then as the curve gets shallower here, you see a decrease. That's the basic idea of what the marginal product of labor is showing. Is the rate of change of the total production or total output. I think the marginal product of labor, that curve, shows diminishing returns a lot more clearly. Because we see it increasing at first, and then we see it going down. You guys have any questions about this so far? I know a lot of numbers, a lot of graphs. Basic ideas, we're looking at diminishing returns. If you add more workers to fixed capital, your output is slowly going to decrease over time. The additional output you're getting is going to decrease over time. You can only be so productive when you have that certain number of pizza ovens. And important to remember, average total cost, U-shaped. It falls initially, and then we see it increase again. And the reason we see it increasing again is because that marginal product of labor is decreasing. So the average cost of producing a pizza is going to increase as you're adding these additional workers, because going from that 5th to the 6th worker, you're only getting 15 additional pizzas. But you're still paying whatever that wage is, $650 for that employee to only get 15 pizzas back. That's going to drive your average cost up. But initially, going from like 1 to 2 workers, because they're adding so many pizzas, in this case, 250 pizzas, that's dropping the average total cost. So initially, we see it fall as the marginal product of labor increases, and then we see the average total cost rise as the marginal product of labor is decreasing. I'm not going to get too in the weeds with talking about how to calculate the average product of labor or what it means. I just want to give you the very simple overview about this. So the average product of labor is going to be the total output produced by a firm divided by the quantity of workers. So this example, for 3 workers, they can produce 550 pizzas. So the average product of labor is, in this case, 550 divided by 3, or 183. You can also think of it as the average of the marginal products of labor. The marginal product of labor for these 3 workers are 200, 250, and 100. You sum those, it equals 550. So 2 different ways to visualize it, whether you want to look at the total product or sum the marginal product. Same basic thing. In this case, it's going to be 183. When we only had 2 workers, the average product of labor was higher. So because the marginal product of labor in this case was 200 for the first, 250 for the second, the average product of labor was 225 for 2 workers. When we had 3 workers, it was only 183. So it goes down as we add that third. The reason this happens is because that third worker had a lower marginal production than the previous one. So that third worker, see the marginal product of labor here, 200 and 250 for the first 2. That third one only added 100 additional pizzas. So because, again, that their number is so much smaller than the first 2, that's going to drag down the average. Like that kid in your fraternity, on your sports team, your sorority, that has a really low GPA, bringing down the group average. Have something to say, Glenn?
No, he did your stuff.
Looks like Joe Kelly expects an apology.
Sorry, Joe.
I'm their academic, Theta's academic advisor, so I know how bad their grades are.
A lot of good this semester. I'm fine.
So when the next worker we're adding has a higher marginal output than the average product of labor is going to increase. When they have a lower average, it's going to decrease. So this third employee here, they're adding 100 additional pizzas. If, let's say their marginal product of labor was 300 pizzas, it's greater than the average of the first 2, so that's going to bring up the average product of labor. But because it's 100, it's lower than what the first 2 are producing, it's dragging that average down. Another example is average GPAs. I know it's a little tough to see here. They love writing really small on these slides. We're looking at Paul as this example. He has a really poor GPA at first. First semester is a 1.5, second semester is a 2.0. So his cumulative GPA is just going to be the average of each of those semester grades. After his freshman year, he starts doing better, 2.2 sophomore year, 3.0, 3.2, 3.0. And then his senior year starts to fall again. I guess he turned 21 and started going to the bars. So it drops to 2.4 and then 2.0 for the last semester. So that bad case of senioritis. What we see here is his marginal GPA or his GPA each semester. And then near this other curve is the cumulative GPA, so what the average is. So if any of you had really bad GPAs your first semester, or really good GPAs your first semester, you can understand this process. So Paul here starts out with a low GPA. He has a 1.5, then adds a 2.0 to it, and it increases over time. We see that cumulative GPA slowly increasing, but because he starts out low, with a 1.5 and 2.0, it takes a while to bring that up. Now, as long as his each semester GPA, or his marginal GPA, is higher than his cumulative GPA, it's going to increase it. So we see, going from fall to spring to junior, he goes from a 3.2 to a 3.0. So the marginal GPA is decreasing. But his marginal GPA is still higher than his cumulative GPA. So the cumulative GPA is still increasing. It goes from a 2.38 to 2.48. So even though the marginal GPA is going down, because it's above the average, the cumulative GPA is still going up. And that happens until his last two semesters. His GPA dips below his cumulative GPA. At that point, the cumulative GPA starts falling again. We see the same thing going on with marginal product and the total product of labor. Yeah, so as long as we don't have an actual graph here. Okay, so as long as the marginal product of labor is greater than the average product of labor, it's going to bring the average product of labor up. And once that marginal product of labor dips below the average, it's going to bring the average down. So we see going from one worker to two workers, the marginal product of labor increases. The average product of labor is going to be 200 for the first one. So 250 is greater than that. It's going to bring up the average product of labor. Then we have that third worker. Marginal product of labor is only 100, so it's less than the average. It's going to bring the average down. And then going forward, it's going to get less and less and going to continue to bring down the average product of labor. So that's basically why we see the relationship here. We see marginal product of labor flattening here, getting less and less, marginal product decreasing. Now, I'm not going to have you calculate the marginal cost or worry about that, but again, it's something I want to work through so you understand what the hell that means when we're looking at the marginal cost curve. So the marginal cost is going to be the change in a firm's total cost from producing one more unit. Yeah, when you're producing that next unit, how much is the cost going to change? So you can think of it as the change in the total cost divided by the change in the quantity of labor for this example, because labor is our variable cost. The triangle, the Greek letter delta, just means change when we're looking at, or when we're using formulas. Again, this isn't like something I'm going to expect you to memorize this equation. But the basic idea is, as you change the total cost, or what's the change in total cost as you change quantity of labor. For our examples, the change in the quantity of labor is always going to equal 1. It doesn't have to necessarily equal that, but we're going to keep it simple and keep it 1, so you only have to worry about what's the change in the total cost. So you don't have to, because if it was, say, for example, if we had increased by 3, Q by 3, then you have to divide the change in the total cost in this case by 3. We're just going to work with 1, keep it simple. So it's more intuitive. So here we have our average cost and marginal cost on the same graph, like we had the cumulative GPA and each semester GPA. So the first two workers, first worker increases, the marginal product of labor is 200, second one is 250. At first it's 0, doesn't exist. So both of those are increasing. after that second worker, the marginal product labor is going to start falling. Yeah, 150, 25, 15. So we end up with higher marginal costs for those workers. The marginal product labor increases, you have a falling marginal cost. As you add that second worker, because they're producing even more for the same like wages you're paying them, that marginal cost is going to fall. It's going to be lower than it was before. You're hiring that worker for what, $950 in this example, I think. You're paying $950. The first one's making you $200. You're paying that second one $950. They're making you $250. So they're becoming more productive. So lowering your marginal cost. Then you add that third worker, and they're not as productive. You only have those 2 pizza ovens. So then the marginal cost starts increasing again. In this case, $6.50, $13, $26, $43 as you go on and add more and more because they're less and less productive. So our average cost curve, more difficult to see because of how high the y-axis is, but it's still that U shape. Decreases and then increases. The marginal cost curve is going to be, in most cases, when you draw more like a Nike swoosh or a check mark, you get that. It decreases at first and then sharply increases as those last workers are less and less productive. Now remember, if the marginal cost curve is below the average cost curve, the average cost curve is going to be decreasing. When the marginal cost curve is above the average total cost curve, it's going to be increasing. I've been trying to drive that home because the marginal cost curve is going to increase the average total cost curve at the average total cost curve's minimum point. This is very important, and you're going to need to remember this for the next 3 chapters. I'll draw it so it looks cleaner than that. Here's our marginal cost curve. And this will be what? Quantity or the number of units. And this will just be the cost. And your average total cost curve, it's like U-shaped. That right there, where the marginal cost curve crosses that, is its lowest point. Again, that's going to be important when we get to the next couple chapters when we're working through what firms are actually doing, how they're making those production decisions. See if there's anything else I want to say for you. Okay. Nothing else I wanted to add in here. Any questions about this part? All right. So finally, we'll look at graphing these cost curves. These are the general cost curves that firms are going to face in any type of industry they're in. So we have that relationship from the beginning. This was a definition. Total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost, because all costs can be split up into either fixed or variable. If we divide both sides by the output, we can get another relationship to work with. The first is the average total cost, the total cost divided by the quantity produced. The second is the average fixed cost. So the fixed cost divided by the quantity produced. And the third is the average variable cost. So the variable cost divided by the quantity produced. So we can also say that average total cost equals the average fixed cost plus the average variable cost. I know, thrilling stuff. But we're going to be graphing all 3 of these curves, and these are going to help us out later. So average total cost and average variable cost both have U-shaped curves. Again, they're U-shaped because in this case, they're just a result of the increase in workers' wages. So because we have that increasing marginal product of labor and then decreasing marginal product of labor, we get those U-shaped curves. So we have the average total cost curve up here. The average variable cost curve here. For both the average variable cost and the average total cost, it's going to intersect the marginal cost curve at its lowest point. And this is important to remember. The average fixed cost is going to start high, and then it's going to steadily decrease over time. The reason being that a fixed cost, by definition, does not change. So in this example, it's $800 no matter what. So as you produce more and more pizzas, the average fixed cost is going to go down further and further. If you sum on this graph here, the average variable cost and the average fixed cost, put both these curves together, you end up with the average total cost curve. And since that average fixed cost falls towards zero over time, the average variable costs and average total costs start out pretty far apart, but they end up converging, getting closer and closer. So as you produce a lot, you end up with, I don't know, we're working with, this example, 6 employees is the max. As we get to that height, that number of workers, we end up having our average total cost being primarily a result of variable cost. Fixed cost becomes less and less of a concern for the employer at that point. All right, so this was looking at the short run. These examples and drawing these cost curves, this is, again, because there's a fixed cost, because there's some resource that or some input that you're unable to change, we're in the short run. In the long run, firms have a lot more decisions that they can make. They can decide to change any of their inputs, remember. So they can get a new factory, they can change, the actual products they're making, fire all their workers, hire all new workers, anything like that. So there's no distinction between fixed and variable cost. Everything for them is a variable cost at this point. So we look at the long run average cost curve, we can see the lowest cost where a firm's able to produce a given quantity of output in the long run. Again, no inputs are fixed here, so they can change anything they want. They have a full range of decisions at their disposal. So we can use this to understand the idea of economies of scale. Economies of scale is when a firm gets larger and larger because they have this specialization, this division of labor where people are focusing on narrow tasks. They're able to increase their output and lower their average total cost. Workers are becoming more and more productive. Like adding that second worker for Jill Johnson's Pizza Shop. In this case, they're adding hundreds and hundreds and thousands of workers, and they're still increasing their marginal product of labor. They're still becoming more and more productive. So their average cost, their labor costs are falling substantially over time. So we can look at 2 car factories. So the one on the left, the average total cost curve for a small car factory. We'll call that Tesla. And then we have the average total cost for a large car factory. We'll say Ford. So there are pretty high fixed costs in the auto industry. It's a difficult industry to break into because the cost of plants are extremely high. All the equipment that goes into it are going to be, extremely costly. And all the raw materials you're using to make those cars are going to be pretty expensive. But because of these high costs, if you're producing a small number of cars, you're going to end up with a higher average total cost than if you're producing a larger number of cars. So in this example, if Tesla chooses to produce 20,000 cars, they're going to be at this point up here, the average cost of $52,000 per car. Now, given the plant they have now, the workers they have now, they can obviously expand that some, but they're kind of trapped in this instant. They can still increase output and move along their average total cost curve to decrease the average total cost. So let's say in this case instead of 20,000, move down here and produce, call it like 90,000. And they can lower lower their average total cost from say 52,000 to maybe 48,000. They can increase their production by say adding more workers. Maybe they can add more equipment within their factory or get better equipment for their factory and end up lowering their average total cost. Again, because the workers they have are going to become more productive as they're focusing on more narrow tasks. Now, Ford has huge production facilities. They have a ton of employees. Their average total cost curve is going to dip much lower than Tesla. It dips all the way down here to $27,000 for average total cost to make 200,000 cars. So for Ford, they have a much larger output is more efficient for them. They end up producing a much lower cost. So for an automaker, in this case, it makes sense for them to grow larger and larger if they're going to be able to reduce their costs over time. Early in the auto industry, there were hundreds and hundreds of car companies. And when it first started out, people that made wagons started producing cars, people that made bicycles, people that made like early tractors and like farm equipment, all jumped into making automobiles. And they're all different based on like what industry they came from. But pretty early on, by like the 1920s, so 15, 20 years into it, the big companies started buying up all these smaller ones because it was more efficient for them to grow larger. And one of the things that Ford did, there's a slide coming up and I'll talk about it now. What Ford did was create the assembly line, which sounds kind of straightforward and simple to us, but was revolutionary for its time. Originally what they would do was what they call batch production, where the employees, they'd have like a team, say 4, work and they'd build a car from like the ground up. Instead, what Ford said is, how about everyone does one little piece of work on this car? You focus on, putting the wheels on. You focus on putting on the windshield. You focus on this part of the engine or that part of the engine. And just send the car down the line and slowly add pieces to it. That dramatically increased their production, made them much more productive. So with the same number of workers, they could produce a much greater number of automobiles. That gave them these economies of scale so they could grow to be much larger and lower their costs as they were growing larger. Again, for Jill Johnson, this wasn't the case. Once she added that second worker, it was more expensive to grow larger. Their average costs were increasing. So for Jill Johnson, you know the numbers, but at 2 employees, she was here at her like minimum average total cost. She's adding 3, 4, they're increasing. For an automaker like Ford, they're adding thousands and thousands and thousands of employees, and they're still lowering their average total cost. Because as they're adding more and more, they're becoming more and more productive. There's some point called the minimum efficiency scale where the firm has exhausted all their economies of scale. At that point, they can't lower their average total cost. So at that point, no matter how large they grow, their average total costs are staying the same. They may want to keep growing if their average total cost is literally the same, because they can sell more units at that point, but they're not growing more efficient. Firms will tend to grow, if their managers know what they're doing, will tend to grow when they're experiencing economies of scale. That's a great situation to be in as a firm or as a manager. But eventually, they're going to reach a point where they can't get any cheaper. As the firm starts to grow larger, other things are weighing on the firm, making their employees, at first, stay at the same level of productivity and then increase. So, or I guess, decrease their efficiency, increase the average total cost. So this is the case where Jill Johnson, because she only has 2 pizza ovens, workers aren't getting any more efficient. In this case, it's the long run. She could add 100 pizza ovens, but eventually it's going to stop being efficient. She's going to stop getting those gains from economies of scale. So we call this constant returns to scale. So first you have economies of scale, where as a firm gets larger and larger, their costs fall. Then they experience constant returns to scale. So their average long run costs are staying the same, no matter how much they increase production. how eventually as a firm grows larger and larger, those costs are going to increase. Their average cost is going to increase. No matter how much capital they add, how much labor they add, it's going to start getting more expensive. We call that diseconomies of scale. So as a firm that's experiencing diseconomies of scale increases their production, their average costs are going to rise. Again, this was Jill Johnson adding that third employee. There's a lot of reasons, or there's several reasons why this can happen. When a firm gets large, it gets difficult to manage effectively. At one point before the financial crisis, GE had so many unrelated lines that it was very difficult for Immel to manage them all, to make the best decision, because you need a lot of expertise to do good in all these different markets. Remember we talked about how people lack perfect knowledge? Even managers do a bad job figuring out what consumers need, and they need that market feedback. If you're involved, if you have, what is GE? They made appliances. They're also making airplanes. They own a TV network, all these different things, all these very different types of industries. It's hard to have that kind of knowledge and that expertise to run each of them effectively. Go ahead, sorry. I was just on a roll.
Is that graph bottoming out? Is that considering firms going outside of their company to lower costs, like how you said GE was expanding? If Ford wanted to lower the cost again, is that considering say if they would start producing their own steel? Is it considering when firms do stuff like that, or is this only for their own production?
It is considering if they go outside like that. Yeah, vertical integration is another thing, might as well bring it up now, where a firm decides to go and buy one of their suppliers. They figure it's actually, or maybe they just do it in-house. They figure it's cheaper for them to make it themselves than to buy it from someone else. So typically when they do that, they're going to be experiencing economies of scale. So they'll be in this part of the curve, because they'll be decreasing their average total cost by doing it in-house. A lot of time, these large companies don't do that, because once you become a certain size and you're ordering so much from your supplier, you get those bulk discounts. So the textbook gave an example, Walmart, and I think Ford is the other one. And once they grew to a certain size, the people that were supplying them, just gave them huge discounts. A, because it's cheaper to ship one, fully loaded tractor trailer to one place rather than send it to 5 or 6 places and unload half of it. Some is they now have market power, which we'll talk about later, where if they said, well, no, we'll buy from someone else, that company would be screwed, missing a huge part of their sales. Another reason we get diseconomies of scale is that firms have to employ workers or other factors of production that are less well suited to production. So let's use Ford for an example. Now it's not people working by hand. Now we're using a lot of machines for production of automobiles. That requires a decent amount of specialized knowledge about how to work this machinery. If they grew production substantially, they had to hire a bunch of workers that didn't have any knowledge, any background knowledge of how to work those machines, any skills. Some people are just really good at working with their hands and figuring out what's wrong with something. They had to pull other people that aren't as good into that. They're gonna get less production from them. They're gonna be less productive than those initial employees. Remember how early on we talked about relative cost of these resources being important for determining what needs to be produced to maximize consumer welfare? If say they need to purchase more steel, because they're increasing production from 200,000, 400,000 to 500,000. So we're slowly seeing this increase in average total cost. From here to here, average total cost is 27 here, then it's 32,000. We go up here and get these diseconomies of scale. Well, maybe the steel has more value for consumers in a different use. So if Ford wants to buy more steel to produce these cars, they're going to have to spend even more. They have to pay more from their suppliers in order to get it, because their suppliers could get more money selling it to someone else, some other industry that consumers get more benefit from. Another idea is transaction costs. We talked about costs like last chapter. Or he talked about transaction costs in the case of bargaining for externalities. He also talked about transaction costs in determining the size of a firm. His basic idea was the firm exists because there's transaction costs. So instead of everyone doing their own work as like independent contractors and selling it to like the highest bidder, he said the transaction costs are too high. Figuring out who to sell to, who to buy from is too unwieldy. So we organize into firms to make that easy. These are firms are going to grow until the transaction costs reach a minimum. Once the transaction costs begin increasing, then firms are going to stop growing. So he suggests basically the same idea here, this economies of scale. Firms are going to grow larger and larger because it gets cheaper and cheaper to produce, so they become more productive. But at a certain point, they're going to stop growing. It becomes too expensive to be large. So maybe if you bought one of your suppliers in vertical integration, maybe that's getting too expensive to try to run that too. Think of the difficulty of management, and the Coast thought of the difficulty of management as a transaction cost. So you may divest that business, where you actually sell it off, spin it off into its own company. Let specialized management take care of that, because it's cheaper to actually purchase from them than to run them and produce whatever resource you need for your production on their own. Anyone watch BoJack Horseman? Okay, so the bumper. You know they have that like running joke every now and then, where they just have all these like large companies combined. It's like GlaxoSmithKline, Amazon, Walmart, like 4 other things. Basically suggesting that companies are going to grow larger and larger and turn into like 3 or 4 monopolies running everything. Very unlikely that's ever going to happen because of diseconomies of scale and because of Ronald Coast's idea of transaction costs within a firm. Some industries, auto industry is a great example, because there's very large economies of scale. We have a small number of firms that grew extremely large. Ford, GM, Chrysler in the US, a few other foreign automakers, but there's not robust competition like we see with, say, grocery stores or pizza shops. So in some industries, there's naturally really large economies of scale. We'll see large businesses there. But they're only going to be able to grow up to a certain point, at which point they become inefficient, their average total cost starts increasing, and those firms either have to break apart or they end up going bankrupt. And again, GE had serious trouble, had to spin off a bunch of their side companies. Sears, which was huge at one time, declared bankruptcy a couple years ago. A&P was the largest grocery store. I think they had like close to 50% of like grocery store sales in the country at one point. They completely shut down their grocery business in like 2016, and now they sell like tea or something. So we see these companies that were quite large at one point, because of diseconomies of scale, end up having to shrink back down again. So you don't have to deal with all these curves confusing things. Here's a very simple one, a graph of this that I made myself in paint. You have economies of scale where the average cost is falling, reaches some minimum point, and your firm gets constant returns to scale. So they keep producing more and more, but the average total cost is staying the same. Eventually, they reach diseconomies of scale. The more you produce, the more average total cost increases. No matter how much capital or any fixed cost a firm adds, once they reach diseconomies of scale, the average total cost is going to increase. They've reached that natural limit, and the more they produce, the more their costs are going to increase. It might be like Ford, like the automakers, where it's at a huge level of production, might be a pizza shop where it's a pretty low level of production, but you're gonna hit it eventually. Okay. We'll end the chapter by just breaking down why we see this in the auto industry. Having more workers allows for specialization. When you're producing cars, there's a lot of different tasks to be done. So if you give everyone just one specific task, make it a lot easier to produce. And you have the large firms purchasing these inputs at lower prices. But eventually, managers have difficulty trying to manage these large, unwieldy corporations. And when you have a lot of layers of middle management, things get a lot more difficult. So Jill Johnson has 2 employees. She can manage it herself, know everything that's going on with her 2 employees. When you've got hundreds of thousands of employees, you need to start having a manager over like this production line, then you have a manager over like all the early production lines and like the middle production, the final production. You have a manager over top of them for the plant. And you have all the different managers of all those plants, so they need a manager on top of them. Manager on top of them. So finally, CFO is all these layers of people below them. So it's difficult to pass knowledge up the line. For the CEO to make a decision about a change for the firm, they need to know what's going on. But the problem is, in many cases, they don't know the knowledge they need to know. That makes sense. The idea of unknown unknowns is that there's all these nitty-gritty details that the frontline workers, the low-level managers may have, that they don't think it's important, so they don't pass it up the line. So this gets lost. And the more layers you have, the more difficult it is to send this knowledge up. This is something people are talking about right now with bureaucracies, and it's the same basic idea. That these government agencies, very difficult to get knowledge up from frontline hospital workers all the way up to the head of the CDC. It's going to take a lot of time, or it might not get up there because people don't think it's important enough to fill out a report and give it to their superior. We basically see this in any large organization where there's a lot of different layers for knowledge to go on. So this is another reason why economies of scale end up sputtering out at a certain point. The Toyota Georgetown plant's president had a good quote about this. The quote's even longer in the text, so you can read that later. But the basic idea, demand for high volumes, growing larger and larger at a certain point gets too difficult. Your focus goes from a narrow task, and Toyota's, they're known for having an incredibly good focus on product quality and excellent management techniques that gets the most out of their employees. He said it thinned out their expertise and the knowledge. So you build up this knowledge over time with all these, not just the frontline workers getting better and better and more skilled at the tasks they're doing, but even the managers understanding their needs over time, knowing exactly what employees need to be motivated or to be able to do a good job or just to be willing to come into work every day. Build that up over years, but as you're focusing on just producing more and more, as you're bringing in new workers and new managers, you're diluting that knowledge. Some people still have it from being there for years, but some new people don't have it. Maybe they don't bring in good corporate culture. Maybe they brought in former executives from Chrysler when they had to get bailed out from the government the first time, back in the 80s. So even though you're producing more and more, even though you had a good company at first, over time it ends up dragging on you. Okay. Yeah, I'll just skip the slides. I already talked about how awesome the assembly line is. I mean, it seems kind of quaint at this point, talking about how the assembly line changed everything because it was literally over 100 years ago, but it really was revolutionary. And the last thing is a summary of the definition of different types of costs. It might be nice to look over for you guys once or twice before the exam, but you're not going to get, asked what the equation is for average total cost or anything like that. What's most important is understanding the cost curves. These are the two most important, marginal cost and average total cost, because we're going to see these literally like this for perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition. Okay, I'm going to skip this connection to the NFL. How much time we got left? 9:01. We got 10 minutes left. All right, I'll briefly summarize the start of the next chapter. Well, first, do you guys have any questions about the cost curves? Are you just glad to be through it? I always ask like other economists that teach them, like, all right, like how do you get through this? How do you make this interesting for students? They're like, you just get through it as quick as you can. There's like no fun way to do it. Try to crack a joke every now and then. Like that's literally it. So hopefully it wasn't too painful. If you're smart, you would have put a pillow in your backpack and then, make your rest more comfortable during this class. Not that I ever did that in undergrad. Okay, so we're gonna look at 4 types of market structures over the next couple weeks. How we're gonna separate these market structures is based on how competitive they are. We're gonna go in a slightly different order than the book because we're gonna go perfect competition, then monopoly, because they're 2 extremes and they're both relatively simple. Plus, learning about monopolies first will help you with monopolistic competition. So we're going to look at how firms interact with buyers to sell what they produce. That's basically the idea of these next 4 chapters. So we'll be using these cost curves, and we'll add in some demand curves to figure out, or to graphically represent how firms try to figure out how much to produce and at what price to sell it at. This is going to have a lot more real-world implications and applications than what we've talked about just in general with these cost curves. So you guys, I know none of you are going to be economists, none of you are going to study this for a living, but hopefully you'll take away some basic ideas from these next 4 types of markets. So if you work for a firm that's in one of these markets, you can have some understanding of what it's like and what you need to do to compete against other firms. So each of these market structures we look at will apply to different real-world markets, so we can understand how these firms operate, what they need to do to compete against other firms, how they're going to behave, so you can have an idea of ability to anticipate what your competitors are going to do. So the 4 market structures, the first is perfect competition. The products in perfect competition are identical. So an example is agriculture. So let's say growing wheat. Every farmer in a perfectly competitive market for wheat is selling the same exact type of wheat. So no matter who you go to buy it from, it's going to be exactly the same. Now for a perfectly competitive market, it's going to be very easy to enter that market. There's going to be low, what we call barriers to entry. So fairly low cost to jump in and begin competing. And fairly easy to do. Now for monopolistic competition, the ease of entry is also very, very high. So relatively low cost to jump into and begin competing. But the products are going to be differentiated. So for the market for computers, for laptops, whole lot of different types of laptops, whole lot of different brands, and each brand is different. Some are more reliable than others, some are lower cost than others. Some are made especially for gaming, some for programming. All these different types of attributes they have for it. So you can shop and find exactly what you need, instead of having everyone be exactly the same. An example of that is like restaurants or clothing stores. So you can see a lot of differences between the products being offered from all these different firms in those markets. The next is oligopoly. Ease of entry is low. So it's a lot more difficult to enter these markets. There's very high cost to get in and begin competing. Because of that, we end up with a smaller number of firms than we do in perfect competition or monopolistic competition. The goods can be identical or they can be differentiated. It doesn't really matter. Auto industry is a really good example. There's high barriers to entry. Very difficult to just start an automaker nowadays. but we end up with fairly differentiated products. And finally, the last type of market structure is monopoly. Entry is, completely blocked into the industry. There's no way to begin competing. It may naturally occur. So maybe like providing electricity in a local market, where there's just no way another company could join and begin competing against it. It could be because the government has blocked entry. So in the case of first-class mail delivery, only the post office can send those letters. You can't send it through FedEx or like any other UPS, IPS, anything like that. And the product is going to be unique because there's literally no competitors. First one we're going to talk about is perfectly competitive markets. There are 3 main assumptions. So there's many buyers and sellers. So there's a lot of competitive pressure. If you raise your price, people can just go and shop elsewhere. If you refuse to pay this like the market price as a consumer, you're not going to have anyone sell to you. The firms are all selling identical products, literally exactly the same. So there's no difference between shopping from one producer and another producer. And finally, there's no barriers to entry. So firms can enter the market very easily. New competitors can jump in if there's reason for them to enter the industry. All right, it's getting late, so we'll end class here. Next class, we'll talk about perfect competition. Well, no, next class we won't be here. So next Tuesday, we'll talk about perfect competition. Thursday was going to be the next exam. Let's push that back to the following Tuesday.